Hello, everyone. This is Ed Brenniger, and welcome to the Eddie Network podcast. My guest today is Maya Frost, and we're talking for the very first time. And um, it's a this is really fun, and I'm I'm envious of you and your family. They have all kind of relocated from parts all over the world to Amsterdam, and I think that's fantastic. And would love to talk about that or talk about whatever you want to talk about. So, welcome, Maya, and tell us a little bit about who you are and what you do.
Well, thank you so much, Ed. I appreciate a chance to be here and have this conversation with you. My name is Maya Frost, and I have for the last 6 years since the pandemic started, been helping people who are at a breaking open point in their lives. And in COVID, it started because I was sitting in a tiny apartment with my husband in the longest and strictest lockdown in the world in Argentina. And I couldn't stop thinking about all the people who had lost loved ones and how they were isolated and didn't have the community to support around them, and the fear and just how hard that must have been. So I decided to contact some of my friends who worked in nonprofits around the world and ask them, who is suffering? Who is falling through the cracks? Who do you worry about in the middle of the night because they're not getting the kind of support they need and you're truly worried about them? And I started with two women who were so much in despair that they could barely get out of bed. And I wasn't quite sure what I was going to do, but I knew I was going to start by listening deeply because I've had a lot of grief in my life. And that's what I would have wanted, is just someone to listen, hold space for that grief or frustration or whatever it might be. And that has evolved in over the last 6 years now into a practice that I call collapse companioning, because COVID was a form of collapse that we all experienced together in different ways. And it was kind of a test run, and we sort of had mixed results in terms of how we responded to that. And now I work mostly with people who are recognizing the patterns that have been shifting, how things are crumbling, how systems are no longer serving us in the way they were supposedly designed to, and how all of these are entangled and colliding, really, and what that is going to mean for all of us and all living things on this planet. So that's the work I do, just on one with people around the world. I've been so fortunate to have had the opportunity to help hundreds of people now in 20 countries. And I have learned so much from listening to a lot of suffering, but also watching them come alive again in a very short period. So, yeah, I feel so grateful to be able to do this work.
Wow, I have all kinds of questions for you. I
Oh,
mean, this
good.
resonates deeply with what I've seen over the course of my career. How the failure systems
Yes.
and the kind of alienation that comes from that for people, particularly if they've sort of
Yes,
invested their life in the company that they've worked for, and all of a sudden they're not there any longer, and it's like a death.
exactly.
There's like they're going through a death, and yet at the same time we're in a world, a social media world, where everyone's supposed to be happy and successful and flourishing, and it's not really that way. And people look at that and say, how can I be that way? But they don't feel that there's any real pathway to that.
Yes, yes. And for many people, I mean, I've had a lot of clients who were in the States and lost the jobs, the roles that they loved, that were either nonprofit or governmental, related to climate, related to a range of progressive topics. And they feel robbed of the position they had, unfairly targeted. So they have a mixture of loss and grief, but also anger and frustration. And so helping them see that they still have options and opportunities. And we go through a process that I call rewilding your imagination, because in these times of so much despair, what goes first is our capacity for creativity. And right when we need it most, right? And so tapping into that again and reinvigorating that is essential for anyone who's trying to face our reality with clear eyes and also see what is still possible for them personally and everybody around them, their family, their loved ones. How can they have some kind of meaningful, joyful path forward despite everything? So, yes, I mean, there's a sense of distrust and disappointment, but also just really all the whole gamut, hopelessness and helplessness and guilt and shame and all of the things are kind of bubbling up on different days depending on the news cycle. So together we learn how to like manage, live with a bit of steadiness and also creativity.
Well, here in the US, we have the phenomenon of politics being very toxic and corrosive, and that people are very, uh, in a general sense, animated over one thing or another, to the point that they
Yeah.
take to the streets and what I have found is that they have a difficulty of knowing who they are separate from the politics or separate from some other social situation. And so whatever is happening out there
Mm.
external to them, they becomes a reflection of who they feel that they are. So
Yes.
everything out there externally is somehow a threat to them. And I wonder if how to to what extent that you see that sort of thing emerging as this kind of anger about life in general, not just grief, not maybe a sense of alienation, but also a sense of anger towards the world at large, and they without knowing what to do about that.
Yes, well, I learned something early on by all this deep listening that there are really two special combinations that come up the most. The first one is grief plus anxiety, and I call that the crunchy combo because people with anxiety have a lot to chew on. They're continually, rehearsing the stories about what to do. Anxiety, the definition of anxiety is fear of the future. So in a way,
Hmm.
we are all experiencing this level of anxiety that we did not necessarily have a few years ago or even a few months or weeks ago. So, as more and more people become aware of this and they start to churn and chew on all of this, that becomes, for many people, incapacitating. It becomes what I call desperalysis because they have this sense of despair and they feel hopeless and they don't feel they can do anything. And also in our culture, we tend to tell people who are grieving for any reason, whether it's a loss of a loved one or a pet or anything else, if you are grieving, you shouldn't make any big decisions. You shouldn't make any big moves. You just need to settle into your healing process, take as long as you need, etc. And that is one way to look at it. And I am all about understanding the need for time to process grief and a recognition of, doing the inner work and the importance of that. However, this is the contrarian view. Um, there is a problem that we're facing now in that because of this cultural message to avoid action, to avoid decisions, just, feel your feelings, many people are settling into this state of anxiety. They're settling into it in a way that it perpetuates itself.
Hmm.
And that, in addition to their listening to the fact that they should not be doing anything yet, creates a sort of anxiety and inaction, anxiety and inaction. And so nothing is moving.
Mm.
Nothing is moving. It's static and just in churn mode, right? And some very interesting research came out, very juicy research came out just last year by Dr. Jed Brewer, who is both a neuroscientist and a psychotherapist. at Brown University in the States. And 40 years ago, he read a 2-page paper that suggested that anxiety was actually a habit and not a condition. And he was just a student at the time, 40 years ago, 1985, but he just couldn't get that out of his head. So that paper came out, yes, in 1985, and it got no attention whatsoever because at that time, everybody was excited about this new drug coming out called Prozac. And so nobody wanted to hear that anxiety could be a habit. They just wanted to try this new drug. So whether you're a doctor or a patient or a particular pharmaceutical company, you were pretty excited about Prozac. Now, fast forward, what we learned about anxiety medication is it only works for about 20% of people who take any given medication, 20%. So what happens to the other 80%? Well, they either cycle through and try every new drug that comes up, making the pharmaceutical companies very happy. Many of them will never find a drug that works for them. And for the others, they either give up on that process of trying to heal and start seeing themselves as a person with anxiety, as an anxious person.
Mm-hmm.
And that is tragic because as Dr. Brewer's research showed, in his study, he was able to dramatically reduce anxiety levels by up to 70% in 30 days using a simple mindfulness practice. Simple. 30 days, no drugs, no therapy whatsoever. And remember, he's a therapist, therapy and psychiatry and psychology. But he basically proved that anxiety is a habit. And like any habit, if you change, whether you're trying to lose weight, you start exercising, eat different, whatever the thing is you're trying to do, quit smoking, whatever. If you can do it for 30 days consecutively, then you're mostly there to changing your habit in a lasting way. And he showed the same thing with anxiety. So when I think about the escalation of anxiety, the acceleration of everything that's happening, and how more and more people will be feeling more and more anxiety than ever before, it's really, I think, uplifting to know that this can be changed and it doesn't take a long time. And we all have the agency to be able to do this if we choose to do so.
Would you
Again, new research. Not
would
everybody knows it yet.
would you say then, and in many cases, not in all, but in many cases, that anxiety is more like a social virus? It's something that's picked up from other people because they see it and they see, well, they're anxious, I should be anxious too, so to speak, or they see it expressed on social media, and so that is they're kind of seduced into believing that they should be anxious when they were not necessarily anxious to begin with.
I think that is definitely a part of it. But an interesting thing is that when you look at the anxiety and how people feel, in this research, he was showing that worry is the fuel for anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
And we are actually reinforcing our anxiety by worrying all the time. And so if we are with people who are anxious, or we are doom scrolling, or having a conversation about the news, whatever it is that reinforces our worry, we are also training our brains to be in that anxious, that anxious mode. And so it takes a shift in our habits, a shift in our mindset, but most importantly, it's just a shift in our imagination, because what he found was there's one antidote to anxiety, and that is curiosity. And that sounds kind of fluffy, right?
Mm.
Like curiosity, well, anybody can
No,
be
yeah.
curious. Well, exactly. That's the point. And so the way to go about changing this anxious habit is to instead ask questions of it, to instead take a look at it and talk to it as though it's another being, to ask questions, to explore, to question why you're feeling the way you are. And now you might think, okay, well, that's just going to dig you in a deeper hole, right? Because you're going to come up with all the reasons. That's the habit. The habit is to reinforce the anxiety.
Yeah.
So you have to change your habit. It's like James Clear's book,
Uh-huh.
when he wrote Atomic
Yeah.
habits. And he had pretty much the same time frame where he said 4 to 5 weeks, you can change pretty much any habit. And it's the same with this. It's just getting out of that habit of reinforcing why you should be anxious.
Oh, I am so with all this. This is really brilliant stuff. I see exactly what you're saying, and I've seen it
I
for
mean,
a
I'm
long
very
time.
excited by
Well, go on. Yeah.
go ahead.
Um, what I see is that people get their signals from various places, and the further distance those signals are coming from, the greater authority we grant them. And the people who are the
Yes.
closest to us, we grant less authority, which and I saw that during COVID, you know, and and
Yes,
it
that's true.
is a very interesting thing. I mean, I went through COVID. I didn't have the shots. I never wore a mask. I didn't do I didn't do any of that because to me, logically, it didn't make sense. You know, I wrote a book about this, about the COVID pandemic as a systems breakdown. It was a breakdown of the systems, and the government was trying to overcome their their
Yeah.
loss of control, and they hyper controlled everything in order to reclaim their control, and it produced the opposite effect, you know. So but that's a whole other
Yes.
story. That I don't really want to go there. But
Yes.
what I saw was I was telling, family members, well, I'm not going there. Why are you going there? And they would always reference some other person. I said, well, do you know those people? And they say no. So why do you believe them? Well, they're authorities, basically they use different language, and so that's what I find is that we have been we have grown up in an authority culture where the authority resides within the organizational structures of society, whether it's government or business or church or whatever it may be, and that the
Yeah.
authority of the individual is really secondary.
And what an interesting thing to think about the fact that we trust each other, the people we know, less than we trust somebody with a big following on Instagram. I mean,
It is a
that's
very
a real
interesting thing.
realization. Yeah. Well, I'd
So
love to talk a little bit more about uh, one way that everybody can shift the way that they are dealing with whatever is coming up for them around the state of the world.
before you go there, before you go there,
Okay.
you said that you had these two things about grief. One was grief plus anxiety. What was the other
Yes.
grief? Is
Mm.
that where you're going? Is that where you're going?
Uh, well, thank you for bringing me back to that. But yes, the other one is grief plus outrage. I
Ah,
call it's the spicy version. It runs a little hot, right?
yeah.
But I want to be clear because rage and outrage are not the same thing. They actually have different roots, even though they look like they should be related. Rage is that sort of uncontrollable, perhaps violent, perhaps irrational fury, and it's based on the Latin word rabies, which in English is rabies for madness. But outrage, on the other hand, is an indignation, intense indignation about injustice, right? And so that comes from the Latin root ultra. So it means beyond. So when something goes so far as to become intolerable, we can no longer tolerate it. That's outrage. So two different versions of a kind of anger, and some people can't really pull apart which they feel, but without a lot of questions and curiosity, and we eventually get there. And the people who carry this grief and outrage combination, for one thing, it's not that they're outraged people, it's that their grief is tinged with outrage as opposed to anxiety.
Mhm.
Those are the people who are most in the place most capable of change for themselves, for their loved ones, for their larger community. Outrage is that fire, and that is fuel. It's fuel for change, it's fuel for transformation. And so I work I work with the people mostly that I can identify as having that combination. We have a long history of, you think about any organization devoted to eradicating a disease or some kind of condition, almost all of them were started by someone who lost a loved one to that particular disease and or that kind of problem, whatever it might be in society. And they wanted to do something about it. They didn't want to just would have to go through the pain they're going through. And I bring up the example of Mothers Against Drunk Driving with Candace Lightner back in the 80s. And it's because of Candace and her grief and outrage after her 13-year-old daughter was killed by an intoxicated driver, designated driver. That's her. She did that. She fought for that. It's why we have legal alcohol driving limits around the world. She did that. So there's that power in outrage. And you don't have to be a crazed outrage person, but a little outrage can do a lot. And I think it's a real force for the common good. And so I look for that spark in clients because I recognize the power that it holds, even if they don't recognize it themselves.
That's very interesting. Very interesting. And I think that that is a manifestation of the modern world that didn't exist before television and social media, because there was no real outlet for that beyond telling your family or telling your community, your neighborhood. And so it's a phenomenon I think that has had a significant effect upon the world, but I'm not sure that it's improved the world. I'm not,
Oh, I mean, if you look at all the combined influence of all of these organizations started by that spark of outrage, I think it'd be hard to argue that it didn't have a positive impact. It had positive impact. I think now what's happening is outrage has become, pretty much what we feel every time we look at our phone. And we suppress it because all anger we feel is detrimental and we shouldn't feel it and we should tamp it down. And we don't want to feel helpless and we don't want to be an outraged person and we don't want to get sucked into the anger spiral. So we tamp it down and that doesn't do any good for us. And it certainly doesn't do any good for anybody else either. There is an element of anger, this spark of outrage that we should be noticing. We should be nurturing, not ignoring.
I agree with that. What I see is that we live in a culture which promotes outrage.
Yes.
And that outrage has detrimental effects on, because what happens is that governments, whether local governments, states, or federal government, begin to use this as a vehicle for control of the population.
Yes.
That's what I see happening. And so
Yes.
the problem, may I say it this way, is that we don't have very good social relationships within the communities we have. So if I feel outrage about something, who do I go to have that satisfied? And what does that mean? You provoked me to really.
Mm.
I haven't really thought about this. I'm rambling on because I think this is important. That maybe what we need is a better way of expressing outrage, but we need better vehicles for that, meaning better
Yeah.
places of where we can talk about these things. And
Yes, we do. And also we need to recognize that it's like you said, we are being fed outrage and it's very intentional. Because we are being pitted against each other against those who disagree with us as a dividing mechanism, right?
all right,
And
that's
that's
right.
very intentional. That is happening. And so, but we are confusing our own sense of outrage at legitimate reasons to be upset about the changes in the world caused by people who don't care about it, other than their own take. I mean, this kind of take. And so it's hard to kind of pull apart the outrage that's valuable and outrage that is created and stoked by the media and all of the other influences that come our way. And that can be very detrimental. So, yeah.
In my first year of podcasting, I interviewed a woman named Kim Witzik, and her story is of her husband being prescribed a certain set of drugs, and he went through a personality change because of it, uh, and I'm
Mm,
trying to remember the story. He may have taken his life. So she
mm,
became dedicated to um, dealing with how pharmaceuticals are developed and how they're marketed and things like that. And she's become a kind of renowned expert on this because she had this experience of losing her husband to
yeah.
maybe poorly prescribed the wrong, the wrong prescription for whatever he was experiencing. And so I mean, she's been in Washington testifying before Congress and things like that. And
Mhm.
so she translated her anger, if there was anger, I'm sure there was, into something very constructive. And I think that's really
Yes.
as my mental process is going through. How do we then take these things that we have felt as outrage and translate them into something that is constructive and not merely obsessive or self
Mhm.
defining or
Yeah.
whatever language you want to use.
Uh, what I've learned is that that spark of outrage carries a protective instinct, not for yourself, but for others, because you don't want someone else to go through that. And there's a certain switch that happens. We do a 30-day process, and around the second week, at the end of the second week, there's always a point at which someone acknowledges what they're longing for, or, you know, what would help them heal. And it somehow turns around so that they are trying to protect and help someone else. And that's where their healing comes from, is the protective mechanism, right? So it's not that they're doing it because they're pissed off. They're doing it because they see the impact of what they've gone through on themselves and other loved ones, and they just can't bear the thought that this is just going to keep happening again and again to other families. And so that's where that protective mechanism comes in, that instinct, that very human instinct to protect others. And once it makes that switch from just pure grief and loss to, the outrage and recognition of how upset they are, and then, wow, what can I do? So it pretty much, it's not as though they have to go searching for a project. It falls in their lap once they recognize what they care about and who they want to protect.
So does the grief ever get resolved?
Yes, again and again and again, I've seen this. And every single time. And listen, I worked with clients I worked with a woman in Japan whose husband was a doctor, and he was one of the first people to die of COVID. And she had to go through a month-long lockdown, quarantine. This was the very beginning. Nobody knew anything about COVID. They euthanized her dog and cat because they thought, well, maybe they were also uh, infected. And so here she was in lockdown by herself for a month. And we were in touch, contacting each other every day. And what she longed for, tapping into what you're longing for, is essential. She longed for her friends. Yes, she was grieving for her husband of 32 years. She was really sad and upset about her pets. And just the fact that she had no ability to do anything, she couldn't choose to do anything. But really, what it came down to was the sense of human contact. She did not have access to her friends. She did not have any, I was the only person she was talking to. And at one point she said, we started talking about friends and how much her friends meant to her. And she said, there's a problem, such a big problem in Japan. I think people have just forgotten how to make friends, but I've always been really good at it. And then she said, I wish I could help them.
Mm-hmm.
That's the turning. I wish I could help them. Look at her situation, but she's thinking, I wish I could help them. And so in quarantine, I helped her create an online course that captured the imagination of thousands of people in Japan who took her course. Then she was interviewed in magazines and newspapers and all these things. And it was a very simple game that helped people get points by doing something in the real world, like talking to a friend on the phone instead of texting, or meeting them in person instead of on the phone, saying hello to someone, introducing yourself to someone, introducing to other people, to each other. All of these real world tasks that people took on. And she has a whole wall of her house that is covered with photos of people with the new friends they made.
Mm-hmm.
People with their arms around a new friend thanks to her course. So that was her healing.
Yeah.
That helped her heal, is to see all of this joy and friendship that was happening all over her country because she chose not to disappear into her despair or just to simmer with her anger and outrage, but to do something, to protect others, to help others. So that's the kind of transformation that's possible in a very short time once that switch is flipped, once they see, I could help them go through something that I'm longing for right now. Have them have that experience if I can't.
Years ago, I mean, we're talking 30 plus years ago, I had begun the process of becoming a leadership person, and had actually it's 40 years ago, and I had immersed myself in the literature of leadership, you know, and I disagreed with almost everything I read
Yeah.
because they saw it as a role and a title within an organizational structure. And over time, as I kind of sought through what my own thinking was, and I studied and did work, I came to the conclusion that sorry, that all leadership begins with personal initiative to create impact that makes a difference that matters. And by saying it that way, it meant that every person within an organization can function as a leader or a leader
Mm-hmm.
of impact by taking personal initiative in the moments where they see it. And what I'm seeing in your work is that you're encouraging people as a way of dealing with the hardships that they've experienced in life to take some kind of initiative that allows them to see them making a difference in other people's lives, and that becomes in over a period of time, that becomes their legacy. It becomes their story, which defines who they are. I am not my grief. I am
Yeah.
the response to the grief. I am this person who has reached out to all these
Yeah.
people and whose lives are now changed because I decided I wasn't going to stay in the wallow of grief and anxiety, or grief and outrage or rage. I was going to change my life, but I'm going to change it by focusing on other people and helping them who go through that which I had gone through.
Yes. And this is such a human instinct. We have forgotten it. We have forgotten that it is normal to act out of compassion for others when we are grieving. Indigenous cultures recognized that those who were grieving had visions and would would emerge from that with inspiration to do something that would make the community stronger. And we're tamping it down by saying, don't do anything, don't make any decisions, don't make any big moves. When every person I have worked with, hundreds of people, has made some kind of big move in the first few weeks of deep grief and transformed themselves, their lives, and impacted lives of many others as well. So I think we're wasting an opportunity in a way to do our greatest service when we are in our deepest place of devastation.
So let me ask you this, and I think this is maybe more personal than would originally think. So all these moves that you have done as a family, because
Yeah.
you've lived in a lot of different places, in extraordinary places. Is there an application of your process to the moves that you've made, whether it maybe is the grief in leaving the place that you have been, or that moving to a new place is a way of dealing with some grief that you had there? Is there an application that comes from actually picking up and moving to a new place in a new? And I have a reason for asking that question that I'll come to in a
Okay.
second.
Okay. Interesting. I've lived in 7 countries. This is my seventh. But, I would say that the only move that was about escaping from the reality of my past and the history of deep grief and loss from literally before I was born, because I was adopted at birth, and my mother was so distraught when the man she had fallen in love with, first of all, had lied to her about being married. And um, she attempted suicide twice while pregnant with me and showed up at his workplace with a loaded gun, threatening to kill him if he didn't marry her. I learned all this later when I met her when I was 17. But I knew nothing but grief and loss my whole life, from before I was born, parents separating at 4, going to live with my grandparents, grandfather dying when I was 5, my mom remarrying at 10, and all kinds of chaos happening after that for me personally. I was a sole survivor in a car accident when I was 15. It just kept going like that. And I wanted to make a break from that. So the only move I made was when I graduated from college. The first job I got was working in Japan, and that's where I met my husband, who grew up just a few miles from me.
Hmm.
But that's the only move that I made out of a sense of putting the past behind me in a way, making a fresh start. And I would not say any of the others had anything to do with grief. I'm a forward uh, looking person. So I would say I was always more drawn forward than I was trying to escape anything back here. So tell me your story about why you're asking this question.
After um, the recession, the Great Recession of the late 2000s, my
Mm,
consulting practice began to fail. It did fail. I mean, I lost all my clients in about 6 weeks in 2010.
yeah.
Um, I began to get some of them back, but it was really clear it was never going to be what it had been or what it had been the promise of, because everybody was waiting for normalcy to return, which it never did. I took on
All right.
I took on the leadership of a nonprofit. I'm a I'm a retired Presbyterian minister, and I was running a nonprofit that was raising money for ministries on college campuses. And
Mm,
and we were running a campaign. We were only going to raise $900,000, and our first gift was $500,000. And then 5 months later, I was fired because I expected the board to give money, and I expected their churches to give money, and I expected their big donors to give money, and none of them wanted to give any money to this campaign. So as we were running out of money, they fired me. And in the midst of that, my marriage of 30 years ended. So here I am, having gone through three losses in about 18 months, 20 months, and I took on a church as a interim for 2 years, and then when that was done, I'm sitting in my apartment and I'm thinking, if I'm going to do anything with the rest of my life, I have to move. I have to start over. And here I am.
Mhm.
How old was I then? I was 60, 61, 62. And I was living in Asheville, North Carolina, and I picked up and I moved to Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and was there within 3 months.
Wow, that's a big move.
Big change. And then when COVID came, I said,
Yeah.
well, it's time to leave. And I moved back to North Carolina. And and I've moved once since I moved back. So it was never about grief. It was always about, okay, this is ending. Let's let's go put myself in a position to start over and to reinvent myself, which is what I did. So the person I am now was not the person I was 15 years ago. So,
And
so
that's something that I find a lot among people who are recognizing the pattern recognition people
yeah,
are
I'm one of those.
seeing things shift. Yeah. They're seeing things shift because they've been in a situation before where they made a big move because they saw things changing, right? If things are shifting in your life, you recognize your business isn't going to be the same anymore. You recognize your marriage isn't there anymore. You recognize your kids have left the house and the community no longer feels the same, or the house no longer feels like yours, like it was before. People who are recognizing their senses about how what they're doing and the decisions they're making, how those things are changing, are the first ones to recognize what's happening in the world. They've already done it. So, especially among the people who have moved, started over, I happen to love the start over process. I love the reinvention process. And I've done it many times and I love it every single time. It doesn't always end up the way you expect or the way you even hope, but it's always a worthwhile experience and you deepen and learn so much in the process. So I recognize what you're saying about how losses can push us towards something else. But not everybody responds to losses like that. I work with the ones for whom they they are at that point where so much has happened that it feels like the natural place for them to make a big move, even if they have never made a big move in their lives. But I have to let go of all that. That's no longer there for me anymore. Whatever it
Right.
was, a job, a marriage, whatever, that's no longer there anymore. So I can either sit here and feel and lick my wounds and feel bad and wait for something similar to come along or try to stir up something, or I can make a clean break and start. A lot of people are going through the process of having to make a clean break, not because they're choosing to, but because they don't have any options, either because of financial reasons or, migration reasons, climate change reasons, whatever it is. And there will be more and more people making big moves, not because they want to, but because they don't have any choice. So I'm not saying that everybody who makes a big move like this is doing it because they want to. Um, but those who have been through an experience like that are the ones who are now looking around and going, where do I want to be now when I see what's happening, what's possibly coming? How do I want to place myself in a way that I feel supported, that I have community, that I have loved ones around me, that I have opportunities for joy and connection and making a meaningful difference in the lives of not just my loved ones, but others around me? And those questions are the deepest human questions we can ask ourselves at any time, but especially now. So, and that's the joy of working with people who are at this point because I know what's possible. I've seen it so many times that even when they are in their darkest moments of thinking, I've just lost everything and can't even picture what's next, going through the process of rewilding their imagination opens up all these new options. And suddenly it's like an epiphany. They see, okay, this is the thing that I've kind of been dreaming about my whole life, and I never really put it into words. It's that longing is coming through. And I think for a lot of us, as we look at the world today, we're feeling that sense of longing for not what we used to have, but a different version of it in a way that feels like it's meaningful for these times.
I'd like to move to talking about family in this context because your story of your
Okay.
childhood was one of trauma. You experienced a lot of trauma. Are you familiar with
Yes.
the website, the YouTube site, Soft White Underbelly? Mark Leta. Are you familiar with
Yes.
that? Okay. So
Yes. 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 Uh-huh.
he's interviewed thousands of people who have also had traumatic childhoods and who have not come through it well. And
Yes.
you have come through this extraordinarily well. And I'm curious there's that word curious. I'm curious about
Yeah.
what it
That's good.
was that enabled you to do to be able to resolve the to put that all that trauma into some kind of package and say put it on a shelf, acknowledge that it's there, but not allow it to dominate your life or to determine what your future life would be.
I think the number one thing is that I met a good man who loved me, and we had a family together. And for the first time, I felt like that was something that was part of me, and that I, I took so much joy from that experience of raising our four daughters, and just that was a hugely healing experience for me. And but I also feel like I had a bit of an edge, and I'll tell you why, because there has been some recent research about this that changed the way I've looked at how I've been able to handle grief. And that is that, of course, we have known for many, many years that any child born to a mother who had an extremely stressful pregnancy, whether it was from disease or fear of abuse or financial, concerns, or being, or violence, or whatever it might be, high cortisol levels, right? We have known for decades that those impact the unborn child. And there have been studies that follow kids through age 10, 20, 30 now, can look at, okay, what were they most, how did they turn out? How were they impacted? And for years, the story was, well, they're going to have they're going to have some limitations in their brain development. They are going to be prone to behavior challenges. They're going to be prone to violence. They are not going to do well in school. They may be antisocial. They may be more likely to be anxious or depressed in their lives. And they may end up in the criminal justice system because they have no capacity to manage their anger. So, I mean, that's a pretty heavy thing to live with. Once I knew that my mother had gone through all that, I was like, oh my God, I'm just waiting, a ticking time bomb waiting for this to go off, right? But in the last 2 years, just the last 2 years, they finally said, what would happen if we separated the sons from the daughters? Like, let's just see how that plays out. What's different? Well, it turned out this, if they did it that way, the sons had even or a higher risk level for all of those situations, right? All of those challenges that they would face as a child and a young adult.
Hmm.
But the daughters were actually protected. There was an interaction between the cortisol and the hormones of the daughters while the mother was pregnant that provided a protective mechanism for them. Now, I am not saying that every daughter born to a mother who had a stressful pregnancy has a gift for dealing with grief. I am not saying that, but it's opened my eyes to a different kind of understanding of how our society might be impacted by that. Because what we see in the world today is rising violence among men, violence toward women, but violence in
Mhm.
general. And we see women growing in their compassion, becoming more educated, using their voices, becoming leaders. Um, And my personal view is that we are in an evolutionary stage where perhaps we are getting ready for some matriarchal leadership based on this increased capacity for dealing with grief, loss, anxiety, depression, all kinds of stress, because it's not going to get any easier to be pregnant.
Hmm.
It's not. The
No.
woman, the people most at risk during any kinds of floods, famines, whatever you could think of, are old people and pregnant women. They are the ones, and children are most at risk. So if you think about that, and you think about the past 30 years that's been leading up to this, an increasing level of stress and agitation and anxiety and depression, it really leads me to think that in a positive way, I hope, we are becoming aware of the struggles that young boys and men are facing and the extra support that they need. But also, we're recognizing that there may be more women who are developing an even higher capacity than they even know to uh, live in a world where those stressors are an everyday experience.
I agree with all of that. And I think that a lot of it has to do with structures, the structure of organizations, and that
Yeah.
the structures that exist today are um, provide women an opportunity that they didn't have before. And I think
Yeah.
they're making the most of that. And I think a lot of these um, structures are not well suited to the historic male mindset and skill set. And and I think that's what I
Yeah.
see. I was a scout leader for 15 years, and 8 of those I was the um, scoutmaster. And what I saw there was boys who had a difficult time growing up, particularly when they had an absent father, and that they were being mothered,
Yes.
and the mother was not really it's not her fault. It was that she just didn't understand what it meant to be a boy, you know, and
Right.
and 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 we saw the boys being herded through things. They would be doing all these different things, thinking that this was going to compensate for their father not being there, but it wasn't compensating at all. But what if they, we would tell the mother in these cases, listen, if you want your son to get the most out of this experience of scouting, then you need to participate. You need to join you can become an assistant scoutmaster, or you can join the committee, but he needs to see you present with this because then it's an
Mm.
experience you're sharing together. And in those cases where that
Yeah.
happened, you could see the commitment of the boy going all the way through to the point where they would become an Eagle Scout, and and then that becomes something. I mean, we always talked about an Eagle Scout is the PhD for children. It's a major accomplishment because you have to do a lot of planning. You have to put a project together. All of these things. You have all these skill sets you have to learn. And so it's like, we called it the PhD for high school kids. So and when the mother was involved, it made a difference. But a lot of mothers were not able to do that because they had other children, and they would drop them off, and the mother would go to the grocery store while they were at Scouts and come back and pick up their son, and they had dropped him off after being at soccer practice. And what I so the my where I really am going with the question of family is that I think that there is something that families are dealing with where grief is at the center of their family for a host of reasons. That's maybe a whole nother segment that we could talk about. But I think that one of the things that we have to have more conversation about is, well, what is a family in terms of the way we should be raising children today in the 21st century. And what I find is that there are a lot of young people, I talk to a lot of young people, and they don't want families and they don't want children because they tell me, well, why would I want to bring a child into this world? And my response is, well, if you think the world is bad, then you already have an insight into what could fix it, to what could change it, how to improve it. And and of course that doesn't go very far with their thinking, but it's really true. If you acknowledge something is wrong, then you do have the capacity. You may have the capacity to do something about it.
Yeah. I was just thinking about your scouting story. And I had two younger brothers. Well, one brother the same age as me and one 3 years younger. And they were both involved in Cub Scouts and Scouts. But for them, it amplified the fact that they didn't have a father. And and I think that was really hard. My younger brother ended up committing suicide. I lost two brothers to suicide.
Oh,
And I think there is so much pain involved in, childhood losses, but also that sense of like if you lose a parent or even if they don't pass away, but you're separated from them as we were, it really impacts your idea of who you are and what you're capable of. And even if you're participating in wonderful, wholesome activities with good people, you still feel the lack. And in some cases, it is heightened because you see others with their dads going on their camporees. At least my brothers did, and they didn't have that. They didn't have that bond with somebody. And so, I think any kind of organization that provides a way to help kids deal with that loss is incredibly important now more than ever, especially for boys,
yeah,
um, because it's a very important aspect of healing that needs to happen, and it doesn't happen naturally. It needs a lot of coaxing and love. It takes a lot of love.
totally agree with you. So, how do people find
Yeah.
you if they want to talk with you or work with you, or what's your way of kind of bringing people into relationship with you where they have a way of working with you?
Well, usually it's mayafrost.com, my website. Also, I connect with a lot of people on LinkedIn because I think that's where a lot of people are talking openly about collapse and about everything that's happening, the metacrisis in general. So there is a pretty sizable group of people and growing group of people who are aware and understanding that it's going to be impacting them and their career, if not now, then certainly soon enough, and how they want to sort of get ahead of understanding what may be coming along in the next few months or years and how they can prepare themselves, not in a prepper way necessarily, but in a way that makes them feel they have agency, still some choices to make, and that there's possibilities for them and their loved ones. So, and their businesses as well. So I think it's slow for, I think businesses are the last to recognize
Hmm.
it because they have a lot to lose. Especially those. In fact, most businesses are based on some extractive model, right? They're using resources of some kind.
Hmm.
And it's very difficult to do the degrowth option when your whole reason for being is to sell things. Um, and so a lot of people, I work with people who are really struggling with their jobs. And so I think LinkedIn is a really good place to connect with people about that. But I also, I think it's important that we have conversations with people around us too. People say, why don't you have an online group for people? Because everybody can benefit from having these conversations, and I completely agree. And I do one-on-one work with clients, and then I say, the best thing you can do right now is instead of getting really involved in an online group with people scattered all over, is to develop your community right where you
I agree.
live. Get to know your neighbors. Start doing things with your neighbors. That's absolutely the key now and going forward. And so I say, whatever time you would have spent chatting with people online or sitting in Zoom sessions once a week, put that time into talking to your neighbors. Put that time into doing something locally, and strengthening your relationships with the people around you. So I'm a big fan of that. I think that's absolutely essential right now.
I totally agree with you. I think direct engagement. direct involvement with people is is a healing thing. I think it goes that far. I think because
Yes.
it it touches the very, I guess it touches actually who we are as people more than what we're doing here, looking at each other through a screen. So I
You can
totally agree with you.
you can hug people. You can sing
Yeah,
together. You can grow vegetables in the garden together. All of these things are very human. We are all missing them, whether we recognize it or not.
yeah,
And it's accessible. Even people who say, I don't really want to spend time with my neighbors because they have different politics than I do. It's like, throw that out the window. It is not about that. It's about building trust with the people around you because of where you live. You have a shared place that you love, that you've chosen to be, whether it's your cul-de-sac, your block, your town, your apartment building, whatever. You people have chosen to be there just like you.
that's right.
So you have things in common that you want to protect and you share together and find those commonalities. That's where you can actually heal those divisions as well.
Well, Maya, it's been great to meet you, and I love this conversation. I feel like we could go on for another hour or so. I think there are other sport things. I would love to know what you when you talk about collapse. Love to have that conversation, but that's a long conversation because it's one of those things that
Yeah.
I've looked at a lot of. That's a really bad construction of a sentence. I apologize. But it's been really great. I look forward to maybe meeting you in person someday, and because I'm planning on more time in Europe, but that's another story for another day. But thank you for being with us, and we'll thank you all for
Excellent.
watching, and we'll see you next time here on the Eddie Network podcast. Bye bye.